They killed Earth's ambassador. The warning marked the start of extermination. The chamber was cold. Not in the way that a room gets cold when someone leaves a window open, but in the way that a place feels cold when it was never built for human beings to begin with. The walls were tall and gray, carved from some kind of dark stone that did not reflect light so much as swallow it. The seats that circled the central platform were designed for bodies wider, taller, and stranger than a human body. And yet, standing in the middle of it all, dressed in a simple dark suit with the small blue pin of Earth's flag on his lapel, Do-yoon looked completely unbothered. He had been an ambassador for 11 years. Before that, he had been a negotiator for 3 different governments back on Earth. Before that, he had been a young man from Busan who had grown up watching his father argue with landlords, city officials, and anyone else who tried to push their family around. His father had never backed down. Neither had he. The Galactic Council chamber held representatives from 17 different species that day. Some of them floated. Some of them had too many eyes. Some of them communicated through vibrations in the air that human ears could barely pick up. Do-yoon had studied them all. He knew their histories, their insults, their pressure points. He also knew which ones were afraid of the Breth Dominion, which was most of them. The Breth were the reason everyone was here. They were tall, reptilian, and old in the way that only empires that had eaten other empires can be old. Their skin was a deep greenish black. Their eyes were yellow and lidless, and they moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of something that had never once, in its entire history, been told no. The Breth overlord, whose name translated roughly into something like "he who ends eras," sat in the highest seat in the chamber, and looked down at Do-yoon the way a man looks at an insect that has wandered onto his dinner table. The meeting had been called under the pretense of trade negotiations. Earth had received the invitation 3 months ago. The message had been polite, even warm, by Breth standards. They wanted to discuss resource agreements, they said, possible routes through contested space, a partnership, they called it. Do-yoon had read it twice, then set it down and told his assistant, a quiet young woman named Nari who kept meticulous notes on everything, that the Breth did not make partnerships. They made examples. He went anyway. He had told Admiral Hyan, before boarding the transport ship, that this meeting was never going to end in a signed agreement. Hyan had asked him what it was going to end in. He had smiled and said, "Something useful." She had not smiled back. She was not the kind of person who smiled when she was worried, and she was very worried. Do-yoon stepped up to the central platform. The translator chip behind his ear hummed softly. He looked around the chamber once, taking in every face, every eye, every delegate who had come to watch, and then he began to speak. He spoke clearly. He did not rush. He told the Breth Dominion that Earth had reviewed the proposed trade routes and found them unacceptable. He said that Earth had also reviewed the Breth Dominion's history of absorbing smaller civilizations through coerced agreements, and had no interest in beginning that process. He said that Earth was willing to engage in genuine, equal negotiation, but that it would not be signing anything under the current terms. The chamber was very quiet when he finished. The Breth overlord looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, through his own translator, that Do-yoon was either very brave or very stupid, and that in his experience, the two were usually the same thing. Do-yoon said that was an interesting observation from someone whose empire had never once fought a species that had the option to fight back. That was when things changed. The Breth overlord stood. He was nearly 3 meters tall when he stood. The chamber, which had been quiet before, became something deeper than quiet. Several delegates leaned back in their seats. One of the floating representatives drifted slowly toward the exit. What happened next was broadcast. The Breth made sure of that. They had their own recording systems running, and they sent the footage across 4 star systems within the hour. It was meant to show every species that was watching what happened when a small, young civilization sent one of its people to talk to the Vreth without understanding who they were dealing with. Do-Yun did not beg. He did not back away. He stood on that platform and he looked the overlord in the eye until the very last second, and the expression on his face was not fear. It was something quieter, and somehow worse. It looked almost like satisfaction. Because 3 weeks before he had left Earth, Do-Yun had recorded a message. He had sat alone in a small room in the embassy building in Geneva, looked into a camera, and spoken for about 4 minutes. The message was encrypted, routed through 7 different relay stations, and set to transmit automatically if his biosign went dark for more than 6 hours. The message reached every human comm relay in known space at 0340 hours, Earth Standard Time. He spoke the way he always spoke. Calm, clear, no wasted words. He told the people watching that by the time they were seeing this, he was already gone. He told them not to be sad about it, because he had known the risk and had chosen to take it anyway. Because sometimes the only way to make a point is to let the other side make their mistake first. He told them that the Vreth had now shown the entire galaxy exactly what they were. And then he said the thing that would be repeated, carved into walls, printed on the hulls of ships, and whispered in the dark corners of alien bars for the next 100 years. He said, if you're watching this, they've already made their mistake. Make sure they understand what that means. The message ended. On Earth, Admiral Hae-Yoon was sitting in her office at the Defense Command building in Seoul when the broadcast came through. She watched it on a small screen on her desk. She watched Do-Yun's pre-recorded message twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for about 30 seconds. Her aide, a young colonel named In-ho, stood near the door and waited. Hae-Yoon lowered her eyes from the ceiling and looked at the War Channel display on the wall. She picked up her coffee, took one sip, set it back down, and said, "Open a fleet-wide channel. Tell every commander we are moving to full wartime protocol, effective immediately." In-ho did not ask questions. He turned and walked quickly out of the room. Hae-Yoon looked back at the small screen, where Do-Yun's face was still frozen on the final frame of the broadcast. His expression, even in still image, was that same quiet look. That look that was not fear. She understood it now. He had not gone to that chamber to negotiate. He had gone to light a fire. The Vreth had given him the match, exactly as he knew they would, exactly as he had planned. The galaxy had watched them do it. And now, every human being, with a ship, a weapon, or a reason, was about to move. Do-Yun had done his job. Now, it was time for everyone else to do theirs. They killed Earth's ambassador. The warning marked the start of extermination. The first thing most people on Earth did when they saw the broadcast was go very still. Not quiet exactly. Quiet is what happens when people have nothing to say. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that happens when something shifts deep inside a person. Something below words, below thought. Something old and fundamental that does not need language to understand what has just occurred. It lasted maybe 10 seconds for most people, maybe 20 for others. And then, all at once, it ended. And what came after the stillness was not crying, and it was not panic. It was movement. Within the first hour, the United Earth Defense Command's communication network logged more incoming calls than it had received in the previous 3 months combined. Reserve officers reported in without being asked. Civilian contractors who worked with military logistics began updating their availability without waiting for activation orders. 3 separate university research departments sent encrypted messages to the Defense Science Division, asking what they could help with. A retired general who had been living on a small farm outside of Daejeon got on a call with the Chief of Naval Operations at 2 in the morning, and said, simply, "Tell me where you need me." Colonel Inho had not slept. He had been in the Defense Command building since the moment Hyon had sent him out of her office, and he had been running on coffee, habit, and a kind of focused anger that he had learned a long time ago was the most useful thing to run on in a crisis. He moved through the building with a tablet in one hand and a headset in the other, coordinating between departments, relaying orders, flagging bottlenecks before they became problems. By the 6th hour, the numbers coming out of the production division were hard to believe. The lunar armament yards had already begun rerouting 3 civilian shipyards to military output. The authorization had come through faster than anyone expected because the person who had submitted the rerouting request, a lead weapons and propulsion engineer named Rhea, had submitted it with so much supporting documentation and so many pre-approved contingency frameworks that the review board had nothing to reject. Rhea had, in fact, been quietly preparing that request for the better part of 4 months. She had not known exactly when she would need it. She had simply decided it was better to have it ready. Rhea had not slept either. She stood at the central console of Shipyard 7 in the lunar facility, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back, a half-eaten protein bar on the desk beside her that she kept forgetting to finish. Around her, the yard was transforming. The frame of what had been a commercial transport vessel 3 days ago was now being stripped and rebuilt into something with a longer hull, reinforced plating along the bow, and mounting brackets for railgun arrays. The workers on the floor moved fast. Nobody was dragging their feet. Nobody needed to be told twice. A young technician came up beside her and asked quietly if she thought they were really going to war. Rhea looked at the hull frame being welded 20 meters in front of her, then looked at the technician and said, "We're already in it. We're just catching up." Back on Earth, in the Defense Command building, Admiral Hyun was receiving the Vreth's follow-up message. It had arrived 8 hours after the broadcast of Doyen's death. It was delivered in a formal diplomatic packet, with the correct encryption headers and all the appropriate titles listed in the correct order, which told Hyun that whoever had composed it either did not understand what they had done, or understood perfectly and did not care. The message itself was not an apology, it was a demand. The Vreth Dominion informed Earth that the ambassador's behavior had been a direct violation of Galactic Council protocols, that his words had been offensive to the overlord personally, and that his removal had been a lawful and appropriate response. It further stated that Earth would be expected to send a formal letter of acknowledgement, accepting the Vreth's correction and confirming Earth's understanding of proper diplomatic conduct going forward. Hyun read the message once, folded it closed on her screen, and did not respond to it. What she did instead was call a meeting of every fleet commander with active deployment status. The meeting was held in the main strategy room, and it lasted 40 minutes. Hyun did not give a speech. She laid out the operational framework, the projected timelines, the assembly points for each fleet group, and the rules of engagement. She answered questions directly and without decoration. When one of the older commanders asked whether they were certain about this, whether perhaps there was still a diplomatic path, Hyun looked at him for a moment, and then said that the diplomatic path had been Doyun's job, and that he had done it, and that what he had done was show the entire galaxy what the Vreth were, in front of 17 species, on a broadcast that could never be taken back. The time for diplomacy, she said, was over. The time for the other thing had started. The other thing, in this case, was 200 warships. They were assembled over the course of the next 60 hours at 3 different staging points outside the solar system. The fleet that gathered was not loud or showy. There were no speeches transmitted between ships, no music played over the intercoms. The crews were professionals, and professionals, when they are preparing for something serious, tend to get quiet, in the same way that the rest of Earth had gotten quiet when the broadcast came through. Not empty quiet. Purposeful quiet. The Vreth received the sensor ping at 0211 hours, Vreth Standard Time. The ping was not an accident. Hayun had ordered it sent deliberately. 200 ships, sitting at the edge of Vreth space, making no aggressive move, broadcasting nothing except their presence. It was a courtesy, in a way, a notification. The Vreth Dominion's response came back within minutes. It was dismissive. Their military command sent a single message, informing the human fleet that it was operating in contested space without authorization and should withdraw immediately. The message also noted that the Vreth Dominion had destroyed 43 military forces across its history, and that the human fleet, whatever its size, should not interpret patience as weakness. The message reached Hayun's flagship, the Soul, just as she was finishing a review of the tactical overlay for the opening engagement. She read it, handed the tablet back to her aide, and picked up the fleet-wide comm. Her voice went out to every ship, every crew member, every person in that fleet who had come here because Doyen had lit a fire and trusted them to carry it. She said, "You killed our ambassador. We gave you 72 hours to surrender. That window is now closed." She set the comm down. Across 4 star systems, every alien diplomat, every council delegate, every frightened civilization that had been watching since the broadcast listened to that sentence and felt something they had not expected to feel when looking at humanity. They felt afraid. Not of the ships. Ships could be counted, and the Vreth had more of them. Not of the weapons. Weapons could be matched, and the Vreth had better ones on paper. They were afraid of the tone, the complete and total absence of doubt in that voice. The way it sounded like a person who had already decided how this ended and was simply walking toward it. Humanity was moving, and it did not look like it planned to stop. They killed Earth's ambassador. The warning marked the start of extermination. The Vreth had a word for the kind of battle they preferred. It translated roughly into the arranged death, and it described a very specific kind of military engagement, one where the larger, better-armed force moved in a straight line toward a smaller, worse-armed force, and the outcome was settled before the first shot was fired. In 43 military campaigns across their history, every single engagement had been that kind of battle. They had never fought anything else. They did not believe anything else existed. Commander Tesu had read the Vreth military history files very carefully. He had borrowed them from the intelligence division 6 weeks before the fleet left Earth, and he had gone through them the way a person goes through a puzzle, looking for the pattern underneath the pattern. What he found was not surprising exactly, but it was useful. The Vreth were powerful, experienced, and completely predictable. They had won so many times in the same way that they had stopped imagining there was any other way to win. That, Tesu had written in his personal notes, was going to be the problem for them. He was 39 years old and had been in the Defense Force for 15 years, most of them spent in rapid deployment operations, the kind of work where the plans changed 3 times before you hit the ground, and you had to be comfortable making decisions with incomplete information, in bad conditions, with people shooting at you. He was not a large man, and he did not speak loudly, but the people who served under him had a way of standing a little straighter when he walked into a room. Not because he demanded it, but because there was something about the way he moved and thought that made people feel like things were going to be handled. When Hayun had called him in to discuss the assault plan for Breth Prime, he had come with 3 different approaches already drafted. She had looked at all 3, asked a few questions, and told him to use whichever one he thought was best. He had chosen the one she least expected, which was, he suspected, exactly why she had offered him the choice. The battle began at dawn, by Breth Prime's local clock. The human fleet did not come in a straight line. That was the first thing the Vreth noticed, and the first thing that disrupted their prepared response. The standard Vreth counter formation was designed to meet a frontal assault. Heavy armor at the front, long-range guns along the flanks. Reserve ships held back at a standard distance to plug gaps. It was a very good formation for meeting a force that was charging straight at you. It was a terrible formation for meeting a force that was coming at you from 6 different angles, in staggered timing, with no obvious center of gravity. Tezu's vanguard came in from the upper left of the planetary approach vector, a direction that was not a standard attack angle, because it required passing through a region of light debris that most tactical systems flagged as a minor navigation risk. Tezu had looked at that debris field and seen cover. He moved his ships through it at a speed that made his own navigation officers nervous, and came out the other side, inside the Vreth defensive perimeter, before their targeting systems had fully locked on. The Vreth command was still adjusting its formation when Tezu's second wave, led by his wing commanders, hit from the lower right. Then the third wave from directly above. Then the fourth from behind the planet's moon. On the bridge of the Incheon, a signals officer named Gia was working at a pace that made the people around her look like they were moving in slow motion. She was 26 years old and had graduated from the Defense Signal Corps 18 months ago. And she had a particular skill for finding the logic inside alien communication systems. The rhythms, the frequencies, the patterns that people built into technology without meaning to, because people always built themselves into the things they made. She had been studying Vreth communication protocols for 3 months. She knew their network the way a musician knows a song they have practiced until it lives in their hands. She found the frequency the Vreth forward destroyer group was using to coordinate its positioning and fed false coordinates into the stream. It was not a complicated hack. It was a precise one. She changed the numbers just enough, in just the right places, that the Vreth destroyer group began adjusting its position based on information that was not real. Within 3 minutes, the formation had a gap in it wide enough for a column of 12 frigates to move through, unopposed. Tezu saw the gap open on his tactical display, and moved without hesitation. The Vreth command realized what was happening, approximately 40 seconds too late. By then, the forward destroyer group was out of position. The defensive line had 3 separate penetration points, and 2 of the Vreth's long-range artillery platforms had been taken out by a strike wing that had come up from below the planetary plane, an approach vector that the Vreth had classified as effectively impossible because it required flying toward a planet's gravity well at an angle that their own ships could not safely navigate. Human ships could navigate it, barely. 2 of the strike wing ships had come out of the maneuver with hull stress readings that were technically above safe operating limits. Their captains had made the call anyway. That was another thing the Vreth had not encountered before. Individual human captains making independent decisions in the middle of a battle without waiting for orders from the top, because they could see what was needed and they simply did it. The Vreth had a command structure where every significant decision traveled up through the hierarchy before it traveled back down. It was a very organized way to run a military, and it worked extremely well when things were going according to plan. When things stopped going according to plan, it meant that the people on the front line had to wait for permission to respond to something that was already happening and changing every second. Tezu had identified this in his research, noted it, and built his entire approach around exploiting it. For 3.5 hours, the battle moved like something alive. Ships took damage. Human ships took serious damage. The Vreth were not helpless. They were experienced, and their weapons were powerful. And once they began to understand what they were fighting, they adapted in ways that were impressive for an empire that had never had to adapt before. But adapting partway through a fight you were already losing, against an enemy that was making new decisions faster than your command structure could process the old ones, is not the same as winning. The Vreth overlord, watching from the command center deep inside Breth Prime, understood for the first time in his long life what it felt like to see something he had not prepared for. He had prepared for a large fleet. He had not prepared for chaos organized so precisely that it looked random until the moment it collapsed into a killing strike. By the time the fourth hour arrived, the orbital defense grid that had protected Breth Prime for 3 centuries was gone. Gone. Taesu sat in his command chair, looked at the tactical display, and let out a long, slow breath. His hands were steady. They were always steady, even when everything around them was not. He opened a channel to Breth Prime's surface. His voice was calm, not cold, not angry, just very, very steady. He said, "Surrender is still an option, for now." Below him, the planet did not respond immediately. He had not expected it to. The Breth were proud, and pride, in his experience, always needed a moment to finish arguing with reality before it could accept what was in front of it. He gave them that moment. He could afford to. The grid was gone. The fleet was gone. The moment would not last long. They killed Earth's ambassador. The warning marked the start of extermination. The Breth overlord said no. It was, in a way, the most predictable thing he had ever done. The delegates from the 40 civilizations his empire had absorbed over the centuries would later say that when they heard the overlord's refusal, they were not surprised. They had watched him for decades. They knew the shape of his pride. It was the kind of pride that would rather be destroyed standing than survive on its knees. In a different story, in a different kind of galaxy, that might have been admirable. Here, it was just the last mistake in a very long list of them. Admiral Hayun received the refusal on the Bridge of the Soul. She read the formal response, which was not short. The Breth, even at the end, had a way of expressing defiance in very elaborate language, and she set it down on the console beside her. She did not look angry. She did not look satisfied. She looked like a person who had known exactly how this conversation was going to go, had prepared for it, and was now simply moving to the next step in the plan. She called Taesu on a direct channel and told him the answer was no. Taesu said he had expected that. Hayun said she had too. Then she told him what she wanted to do next, and it was not what he was expecting. She did not order a bombardment. She did not order a ground assault. She ordered a broadcast. The footage of Doyun's death, the same footage the Breth had sent out across 4 star systems to humiliate humanity, to make an example, to show everyone who was watching what happened to small civilizations that spoke out of turn, was retransmitted. Hayun had it sent to every frequency, every relay, every channel that could be reached from the fleet's position. She had one addition made to the transmission, a single line of text placed beneath the footage. It said, "Watch what happens next." The message reached every species under Breth control. It reached the council delegates who had been sitting in that chamber when Doyun died. It reached the small civilizations that had been absorbed and were still alive inside the Dominion's borders, living under Breth law, working under Breth quotas, surviving in the space the Dominion allowed them. It reached listening posts and diplomatic stations, and the private screens of leaders and governors and ordinary people in dozens of systems who had watched the original broadcast and had felt that familiar combination of helpless outrage and carefully controlled despair. It reached a lot of people who had been waiting a very long time for something to watch. Major Siwu led the first ground forces onto Breth Prime 4 hours after the orbital grid fell. He was not a loud or dramatic person. He had a broad, flat face that tended to rest in a neutral expression that people sometimes mistook for coldness, which he found faintly amusing because anyone who had served under him knew that he was the first person to check on his soldiers after a hard operation and the last to leave when there was something left to do. He ran a tight unit, not rigid, but tight, and they trusted him in the way that soldiers trust an officer who has never once asked them to do something he would not do himself. The orders Siwu had been given were specific. He was not there to punish. He was not there to burn things down or terrorize the population, or do any of the things that conquering armies had been doing to conquered people since the beginning of recorded history. He was there to dismantle military infrastructure, command nodes, fleet production facilities, communication towers used for coordination between Vreth military assets. Everything that made the Dominion capable of projecting force was to be identified, documented, and taken apart. His unit moved through the capital like a machine, precise, systematic, fast. Embedded with his unit was a military historian named Nari. She had short hair and a quiet way of observing things that made it easy to forget she was there, which she had always found useful in her line of work. She had been studying the Vreth Dominion for 4 years, not just militarily, but historically, socially, the entire structure of how they had built and maintained an empire across dozens of systems for over 2 centuries. She carried 2 recording devices and a notebook, because she did not trust technology alone with things she wanted to be sure of. She recorded everything. She recorded the dismantling of the command tower in the capital, which was a massive structure of dark metal and stone that had stood for 160 years and had coordinated the conquest of 14 civilizations from its upper levels. She recorded the moment when Siwoo's engineers breached the Vreth military archive and pulled the complete operational records of every campaign the Dominion had ever run. She recorded the faces of the Vreth soldiers who surrendered, which were not faces of fear exactly, but of something more complicated. The look of people who had grown up being told they were the top of the order of things, and who were now standing in their own city, watching that order come apart, without any of the resistance they had been promised would defend it. She also recorded something else, something that Siwoo had been coordinating quietly, without much announcement, since before the fleet had left Earth. 3 weeks before the first shot was fired, through channels that were careful and indirect, and not easy to trace, humanity had begun passing information to the absorbed civilizations inside the Dominion's borders. Not weapons, not military support, information. Coordinates for Vreth military command structures. The locations of the communication nodes that the Dominion used to monitor populations and suppress organized resistance. The schedules and patrol routes of Vreth security forces in key systems. The kind of information that a people who had been trying to breathe quietly inside a cage could use, if they had the courage and the timing and the right moment to act. The moment was now. As Vreth command structures collapsed under the human assault, the absorbed civilizations began to move. Not everywhere at once, and not without cost. There was fighting in several systems, and not all of it went easily. And Nari was honest in her recordings about that. But it moved. What had been 40 separate, isolated, suppressed populations under Vreth control became something else in the span of 72 hours. Not an army exactly, but not a prisoner population either. Something in between. People who were not willing to wait anymore, who were acting on information that told them the thing holding them down was in the process of falling, and who had decided to help it fall. The Vreth overlord was taken alive on the 5th day. He was found in the command center beneath the capital, in a room that was designed to be the last defensible point in the building, sitting at a table with 3 of his senior commanders and the remains of what looked like a long, unhurried meal. Siwoo's team breached the room, expecting a fight. There was none. The overlord looked at them when they came through the door, and said nothing. His commanders said nothing. They had clearly decided, at some point in those 5 days, that the end had come, and that the only thing left to decide was whether to meet it standing or sitting. They were sitting. Siwoo stood in the doorway and looked at the overlord for a moment. He thought about the broadcast, and the platform, and the expression on Doyen's face in the final seconds of the footage. That quiet, unsurprised look. He thought about what it had cost. What it had cost Doyen personally, and what it had cost the people who had come here to make it mean something. He did not say anything dramatic. He was not a dramatic person. He said, "You're under arrest." The overlord was taken out of the building, and placed under secure custody. He would be tried, eventually, before a tribunal. Not a human tribunal. That was important, and it had been important to Hyun from the beginning. The Vreth overlord would stand before the representatives of every civilization his dominion had conquered. Every species his empire had swallowed and suppressed and bled dry over 200 years. But they would be in the back of the room. This was not their moment to be at the front. As Siwoo's units completed the last of the dismantling work, and Nari filled her second recording drive with documentation, Admiral Hyun stood on the bridge of the Soul and looked at the planet below. It was a strange-looking thing from orbit, dark and heavy, covered in the kind of dense, low cloud cover that made it look like it was permanently thinking. She had studied it many times in the months of planning. It had never looked like a place she particularly wanted to be. She thought about Doyoon again. She thought about the fact that he had walked into a room on a planet he knew was dangerous, with people he knew were capable of killing him. And he had stood on a platform and told them the truth with no apology and no hesitation. She thought that was probably the bravest thing she had ever heard of. Then she turned away from the window, because there was still work to do, and she was not a person who stood at windows for long. They killed Earth's ambassador. The warning marked the start of extermination. The trial lasted 9 days. It was held in the same chamber where Doyoon had died. That had been deliberate. Hyun had suggested the location in the early planning meetings, quietly, without making a case for it, just placing it on the table as an option. The Galactic Council had discussed it, and several delegates had raised concerns. That it was provocative, that it was symbolic in a way that might make impartiality difficult, that it was perhaps too much. Hyun had listened to all of it, and then said that the ambassador had died in that chamber in front of 17 species, and that it seemed right that the reckoning for it should happen in the same place, in front of those same species and more. She said it was not about being provocative. She said it was about being honest. The council had agreed. The chamber was fuller than it had ever been. Delegates came from every civilization the Vreth Dominion had absorbed, from every system the Dominion had touched, or threatened, or circled in the dark. Some of them had to be brought in ships that humanity provided, because their own fleet capacity had been suppressed by decades of Vreth control. Some of them had never traveled this far before. Some of them had never expected to stand in a room like this, in a position like this, ever in their lives. They filled the chamber from the floor to the high gallery. The seats that had been designed for larger, stranger bodies than human ones were occupied by larger, stranger bodies than human ones. And the air in the room was complicated, full of different temperatures and pressures and frequencies of sound, because every species processed the world differently, and all of them had come to process this. The Vreth overlord stood in the center of the chamber, in the same spot where Doyoon had stood. He looked different than he had in his command room on Breth Prime. He was still tall, still physically imposing in the way that 2 centuries of empire tends to produce, still lidless-eyed and unreadable in the way that was specific to his species. But something about the set of his body was different. Not broken exactly, just reduced. The way a very large fire looks when most of its fuel is gone. The charges were read by a representative from one of the absorbed civilizations, a species called the HFY, who had been under Vreth control for 60 years, and who spoke in layered, harmonic tones that required 2 separate translators to render into something other species could follow. The representative stood very straight and read every charge with precision and without hurry, and the chamber was so quiet that the sound of the translator running was audible between sentences. The proceedings moved through testimony, documentation, and evidence over 9 days. Nari sat in the observation gallery on most of those days, taking notes in the margins of her already full notebooks, watching and recording the faces of the delegations, as they heard things that some of them had lived through, and some of them were hearing for the first time. She watched the Breth Overlord during the parts where survivors testified. She watched his face and found nothing easy to read in it. But she wrote down what she observed anyway, because she believed that history deserved to be documented even when it was complicated, especially when it was complicated. The verdict was unanimous. The Breth Dominion was to be dissolved, not as a species, not as a people. That distinction had been made clear and was non-negotiable from humanity's side. Collective punishment of a population was not something Heyoon was willing to support, and she had said so early and often in the planning discussions. The Breth people would continue, their worlds would continue, but the Dominion, the military apparatus, the governing structure, the imperial machinery that had run on conquest for 2 centuries, was to be dismantled completely. All absorbed territories were to be restored to self-governance. All military assets were to be surrendered or destroyed. All systems of economic control over subject populations were to be dissolved. The Overlord heard the verdict read and said nothing. He was taken into custody to serve a sentence that would be monitored and enforced by an independent council of the liberated civilizations. It was, everyone present understood, a longer and harder punishment than death, because it meant that he had to continue existing in a galaxy that was no longer arranged around what he had built. Humanity asked for nothing in return. That was the thing that the other species in the chamber talked about afterward, in the corridors and the meeting rooms and the diplomatic channels that buzzed for weeks after the trial. They had expected demands: resources, territory, tribute, a formal position of authority in the new galactic order, something. That was how power worked in their experience. You won something, and you took what you had won. Humanity asked for one thing, one single thing. The seat where Doyun had stood when he died, the platform in the center of the chamber, was to remain unoccupied. No delegate would stand there. No representative of any species would use it as a speaking platform in any future council session. It would remain empty, always, as a reminder. Not a monument to grief, exactly. More like a standing question, directed at everyone who walked into that chamber and looked at that empty space. A question about what it costs to stand in front of power and tell it the truth, and about what happens when that truth is answered with violence. The council agreed without debate. He went back to his apartment in a city that was quiet in the way cities are quiet when the emergency is over and the adrenaline has finally run out. And he ate a real meal for the first time in what felt like months. And he sat on his balcony in the evening and watched the city lights come on one by one in the dark. He thought about Doyun, who he had met once, briefly, at a Defense Command briefing 2 years ago. He had seemed like an ordinary person. He had a calm face and a dry sense of humor, and he asked very precise questions. He had not looked like someone who was building the architecture of a war. Most people who change things don't, in Inho's experience. 14 hours without moving, in her small quarters at the lunar facility, and when she woke up, she lay still for a long time, looking at the gray ceiling and thinking about the ships she had built and where they had gone. She felt a complicated mixture of pride and exhaustion and a kind of quiet sadness that she didn't have a specific name for. She thought that was probably okay. She thought complicated feelings after something like this were normal, were right, were honest. She got up, made tea, and went back to work, because the yards didn't stop needing to function just because the war was over. Nari published her account 6 months after the trial. It was a long document. It covered Doyun's death, the mobilization, the battle, the dismantling, the liberation of the absorbed civilizations, the trial, the verdict. It covered all of it in plain, careful language, because Nari believed that history should be written so that anyone could read it, not just the people who already knew the vocabulary. It became, in the years that followed, required reading in the educational systems of more than 30 species. Not because it was exciting, though parts of it were. Not because it was triumphant, though parts of it could have been framed that way. But because it was honest. Because it looked at what had happened and said, here is what it cost, and here is what it meant, and here is the question it leaves behind for everyone who comes after. Admiral Haeyun gave one public address after everything was finished. It was short, and there was no ceremony to it. She stood at a podium in Seoul, in the city she had grown up in, on a gray afternoon, and she said that Do-yoon had known what he was walking into, and had chosen to go, because sometimes the only way to make the other side show everyone what they are is to give them the chance. She said that humanity had carried his work forward, because that was what you do when someone gives you something important. You carry it. You don't put it down until the job is done. She thanked no one specifically. She did not ask for applause. She stepped away from the podium, and that was that. In the years that followed, several empires, young ones, aggressive ones, the kind that were still in the early stages of deciding whether to grow through cooperation or conquest, began receiving diplomatic visits from human envoys. The envoys were always polite, always calm, always unarmed. They brought good proposals and asked fair questions and seemed genuinely interested in building something constructive. They were excellent diplomats in every technical sense of the word. But every alien leader who received one of those visits had watched the broadcast. They all knew the whole story. The chamber, the platform, Do-yoon's face, the empty seat, the 200 ships, the 9-day trial. They knew what humanity had done, and how they had done it, and how completely they had done it. And they knew that the person sitting across the table from them, who was smiling and offering a very reasonable trade agreement, was connected to all of that in the most direct way possible. None of them made trouble. None of them tested what would happen if they did. In a small archive building in Geneva, in a room that was not open to the public, there was a terminal that played Do-yoon's final message on a loop. Not because anyone had ordered it to. It had simply never been turned off after the broadcast, and no one had decided to turn it off since. People came to see it sometimes, mostly quiet visits, mostly people who didn't say much while they were there. They stood in front of the screen and watched his face, and heard his voice, and then they left. The message never changed. It was always the same 4 minutes, the same calm voice, the same last line. If you're watching this, they've already made their mistake. Make sure they understand what that means. He had understood what it meant, and so now did everyone else.